I'm going to pose the first question. Your last comments were about who is embedded into what, or who is ahead of whom. The question we always ask, what is it, and all three of you actually touched upon that, what is it that artists and intellectuals do vis-a-vis current situation in the world? What is it that we could do potentially?
I mean, yeah, I think I'm not saying I'm so proud of doing this here, but I think it's a part of it. I think we need to, in this case, just a very specific proposal, and I don't know if it's good, is to actually record some of this material rather than just sort of generally speak about it, and really look at it and sort of deduct some things about it. And then from that, I think it needs to also translate further into how we might, rather than just ask for a more fair media, begin to sort of think about, the complexity of the situation. I don't know. Yeah.
I think if the question is general, then artists need to do, as everyone of us, what is to be done in general. And I don't think that, there might be a work like that, an analytical work specifically of TV or of language, but it can be also direct action or organizing a panel or inviting someone to talk or going on the street for the demonstration in February. I don't think there is one mode of operation. There are several modes that we can work with, and this is one maybe that we presented here, but it's not exclusively. This is what we do as artists. It's not like a professionalized or specialized. Of course, we can do certain things better than others, but this is what we do also together at 16 Beaver, for example. We distribute things that we think are important and open a platform for others to take part also, and send out articles that they think are important or they have written themselves. Again, and when the Iraq war happened, we organized something, Operation How Now Wow, which was a call of action for international artists or activists and other people to do things, and we also did things that we can make.
Organize different kind of events.
I don't know if I'm jumping on.
Do you believe this is artistic work, or is it political activism, or does it make sense at all to distinguish between the two?
I don't know if it doesn't matter really what it is. Of course. When we do a film, and it depends on the context and the topic, but I don't think it's important to distinguish from the beginning. We don't see what we do as art at 16 Beaver, let's say, in the sense of marketing and trying to get a show in the museum now as 16 Beaver as that, so it's not. More in relation to everyday life.
Yeah, but I think in relation to making the question as specific as possible about cultural producers or artists and what we can do, I think what Irene is discussing I completely agree with in terms of broadening that out in terms of different modes of activity. But if we say, one other sort of response to your question is that we might have the luxury of some time, of sort of a leisurely time even, Badiou calls it, but to really sort of step back and, rework some of this material, and unhinge meaning in the case of language, or sort of, I think when I read the dictionary that Irene has, for me it's the experience of reading it is also about just opening up your relation to a term, and so in this case, it's also, coming back to see how, some of the strategies and tactics or effects, unintended consequences of some of this media that is 24 hours, that is not as deliberated as we might imagine. The overall plan is quite sort of deliberated in terms of reaching people and the consumptive aspect of it, but you know, when you got the demand of turning the wheel 24 hours a day and it's a war and you're competing with other media and also entertainment, there's a kind of, there's unintended kind of messages that are also there to rupture meanings. And I think it's also about understanding what is happening, you know? It's not just, we have to understand that from now we can also do things. I don't know. So it's active doing things, organizing things, but also, you know, using that extra time that we have to. But I think if there's no space for translating, you know, what your thoughts are into other kinds of activity, that becomes a little insular and difficult. Maybe that's what Irene is also talking about, but don't we talk too much?
No, I think that the one thing I want to add, and that's that there's a major player in the art scene, and I think that is actually what we've just been watching. So we're not the only persons who are making and creating images and trying to affect our imagination, but these players, I mean, in some ways they are ahead of us in terms of their effectivity, and I think I mean, I cannot speak for artists, but I myself felt as an academic called to not only analyze, but also to try to make things, or try to not just repeat, you know, the push blah blah, but really try to, how the question you also asked, like how do you unhinge meaning or language from the way it's sort of immersing us from the screen.
Jeremiah, you still have that question? Would you mind waiting for us for
I have a different one. I wanted to thank you, the last presenter, for making explicit a relationship to Iraq, which is largely absent, I think, from the general proceeding. And the question I had, because I found your presentation a little bit confusing, was why not simplify your argument and dismiss this material as mass propaganda? I'm not I mean, really look at it in classical terms with maybe it has additional layers of complexity, but largely, structurally, it is mass propaganda, and that is. And I wonder about the people who watched Friends instead of watching TV. Maybe they recognize that it's mass propaganda, and maybe the people you are actually, or aspects of the critical intellectual establishment are in fact legitimating this material by paying so much attention to it. Because, I mean, it seems to me like it is mass propaganda, which would then, because it seemed like that was the conclusion you ended up with. And I wonder if that is the conclusion you ended up with, if public discourse in general is in fact subsumed within mass propaganda, then what implications do you take from that?
I think it's like it's also something that, also in relation to the prior question, it's interesting to hear what other people think. I can respond directly to it, but I feel like I've talked a lot. I don't think the only thing I was saying about it is that it's propaganda. I feel like there were other points that I was trying to make, but at the end of it, I'm not sort of so beholden to the idea of all of us in this room sitting in front of television, recording it, and doing the same thing for sure. You know, it was laborious and tiring, and I'm not entirely convinced the best use of my time. So in a sense, I could agree with you, but not specifically that it's just all mass propaganda. I think.
But even propaganda, I think propaganda is interesting to see in
How
what
it
relies the propaganda, because this missing something as propaganda is not helpful for us if we are used to working with images. Like I took a course on film, and part of it was to see propaganda of like French in Algeria, and you can see like let's say documentary footage of and the person is saying one thing, and then a week later same footage for another place. One is Morocco, and then they're saying another thing. So it's like how can you what constitutes propaganda is interesting. I mean, I never watch TV. but I like it more like that filter.
But also, I mean, the question is entirely like, you know, when someone sees a political, kind of explicitly political work, their relation, if they're kind of a conservative or don't really like this kind of work, is often, well, it's just propaganda, you know? So, like, there's a lot of artistic work that's being produced that is just considered also equally propagandistic, you know? So what do we understand to be propaganda? How does it work? If as media producers we're going to produce something that's about a political subject, how you know, how are we implicated also in that? You know, is a real question that I struggle with. You know, what's a responsible or ethical way to work with images in general, or these kind of political narratives, the things that are unfolding in front of us, you know? I mean, it's also looking at some, you know, filmmakers like Michael Moore, you know, and looking at that, and many people relate to that as propaganda. So the question is, you know, do you agree with this kind of style of video making, for example, like Michael Moore, who sort of reveals the truth, shows what's really going on, you know? It's an open question, but I think it's also interesting to hear what other people think about this, you know, both the questions of what cultural producers are meant to do and what you might have deducted from us, and also in relation to propaganda.
In relation to propaganda, I've come here a few times, and every time Maria begins with this question, what can we as artists and intellectuals do? And I feel more and more upset every time I hear it, in a way. And I think if we're talking about propaganda, this question for me has so many problems that we're trying to tackle. This we that puts us already apart, and the belief we can do something, or the belief that we are immediately on the good side, is for me embedded in that question, which also limits the possible answers, because when you partially replied to this by saying you have the time, which means to be able to do this, to be able to sit here, we must be on the side that is strong, that is free, that has time. And we must take this into consideration, like we are looking at CNN and we say, okay, they're not aware that they are doing propaganda when they're showing Iraqi television. Are we aware? We should be aware. I would love these speakers or people here to kind of talk about the danger of us, the danger of believing we can do something. We, if there's, yeah.
One of the responses that was really debated for a long time to this question was the one of Boris Boudin, who said, just let's do nothing. That would be the safest way to deal with the question. Would you want to rephrase the question? Do you think it's irrelevant?
But Du's position on that of let's doing nothing, you can rephrase it, but just to add to that is one response was, you know, if you're going to kind of basically reproduce anything that Empire has already seen, you might as well just do nothing. But his position was we should try to do something that's unnamed and yet to be seen. It's not like a kind of capitalist relation to the new, but it's something else that he, I suppose, was trying to invoke in this talk he gave a few years back at the Drawing Center. But it's interesting.
But I think that Noah was saying that with this question of what is to be done, we immediately assume that, you know, all intellectuals and artists are on the sort of safe and good side, and that we don't even want to reflect on the ways artists and intellectuals are implicated in you know, sort of perpetual war. Is that what you meant or not?
As a part of it, yes. And I would like that. It's what I meant. I think what I meant is the generalization of the questions is something that is that I think is tackled because you are bringing so many different speakers and different notions to try and tackle the idea of war and art and what we can do. So to start with the general question, I think I wouldn't rephrase it, but I would make a more I would like to make a more specific question to as what are the tools you are using to tackle what you think is the problem of war or terror? So also to see, because we have different definitions of what is happening. So of course there is no general answer. Okay, I'll rephrase. I think I would like to know how you see the problem that you're tackling, and if you think you have the tools, or what are the tools that you have as artists or as you define yourself to react. I hope that was clear.
Maybe I can add. So I would like maybe to add something, so maybe it becomes more clear, I hope. What is also striking to me from your question is that you are asking what artists can do, but they are already doing something, and maybe more the question should be how effective you want your work to be, how much you want to influence with your work, because where does it end? Is it just a text in a kind of marginal magazine, or does it do you want, for instance, René, your work to be presented on TV? And would there be a TV that would show your work?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I thought initially about the thing being a program, but it's hard with all the kind of copyright issues and stuff, but I'm sure I could like TV in Copenhagen or some kind of public access. It's possible, but I don't want to. I think there's a kind of small strain in the initial question that's sort of seems like helpless, or somehow like we can't, you know, what we're doing is ineffective. I struggle with what is efficacious all the time, but I don't discount the fact of like sitting here and presenting material and having 50 years people in a room, and what happens after that, you know, and how people process that and might just work with one idea and then it informs something they do, and then I don't really sort of debilitate myself in that way. I don't act only in this way. That's the important thing. I feel like we need to act in many different ways and test things out. Yeah. It's an experiment. I don't really know, but if someone said, hey, do you want to present some of this material on TV, about TV? I think, yes, sure, you know, but at the same time, I don't think that we being all of us sitting in this room need to sort of lament the fact that we're doing what we're doing. We just, you know, but it's an open question, you know, and what effective means, you know. For example, I don't also assume that being an activist is like a more real, you know, a more political, and what is a political activity today, you know, is a real question to be asked. I mean, there are some people trying to ask that, you know, with us, like. Rancière has this book in terms of that I've just been reading recently. It's interesting in relation to politics and aesthetics, and then you know, Agamben asks that explicitly in terms of what would constitute a political activity today. It's all I think on the level of ideas. It's also this. It's important. It's not something I would dismiss. Ideas are important things. This is, you know, the whole war. What we're seeing unfold is like ideas. You know, that were put into force, of course, but developed over 20 years. You know. Anyways.
No, it just comes from my feeling. I would like many people to see this. That's why I say,
yeah.
You know, it just does not end in such a small, between just a small group of people.
Yeah, I mean, I once imagined I would do like a tour across country, you know. But Irene and I are working on something like that, so we'll see. Yes.
Just a little bit more. I don't know if this one is because I mean, I'm not sure whose question I'm going to answer, but I just wanted to say, I mean, I think that the project that I was involved in was very small, and it sort of engaged what does it mean to be a viewer of these images when you know, of course you do have friends or you know, other stupid stuff to watch. And it's really, when I was reflecting on it in the past weeks, I was struck by how the proximity of language that I was feeling at that moment, and also rereading, you know, if you reread the Bush pictures, etc., you kind of feel the lack of distance that is usual if you're doing cultural analysis. Like very often you can sort of, take an object. I study ideas, and it's kind of fun and wonderful. And this was something that was everywhere. It was on your radio, it was in your TV, it was actually even in the kind of conversations that we had. Even if they were critical, you still have to use the stuff. And so I think that what our cultural people, folks, to do according to me, and I don't, of course there are, answering no, I guess I'm totally presuming some kind of position, but how do you uncouple sensibilities? How do you get people to be curious about things, about bombs, about any, there's lots of knowledge about this stuff in the libraries, lots of histories of bombing, histories of terrorism, and they are, to me, they're worthy resources, and I don't know how to think those things that are in the library or that you can read about when I read the news. So there's this sort of disconnect, and I get sucked in, and I get into this present as if there is no history to what is going on, this 20-year history. And so getting people to feel that there is more to this language than what you can see on the screen is what I think artists would, I would invite them to help me do it. And actually I think that even though I know very little about artistic practice, one of the things that artists can really be effective with is that I think they know how to work with forms. And I think that a lot of cultural analysts only know how to work with content. So they know, they know what the criticism is, but they don't necessarily know how to push it in a way that it comes across.
There's a question. Can I?
So
There's
she
somebody
wants to
waiting.
respond directly to that.
Okay.
Sure.
Take a mic,
Also an
please.
important
Take
question.
a microphone, please.
I think it's also an important question how people get access to media, for example, to make these other ideas visible and to stream, for example, this afternoon. So I think it's also something to think about.
That sounds terrifying.
Well, yeah.
It's not happening.
It is happening.
How many people see that? I mean, that's the question.
I don't know if this is so much a question. What strikes me about all three, is this on?
Yeah.
All three talks is that you seem to be involved in some form or other of a media primer, perhaps? Is that the way in which you could approach what you're... Well, I'm thinking a little bit also about kind of beginning of work of particularly in your case, studying of television and television discourse, really, because that's what you're talking about, right? It's a bit more than just the rhetoric, but the way that even TV is embedding us, as it were. So it's not about propaganda at all. I mean, ultimately, this is where we get our information from, for the most part. So there's no way around it. And Friends is another form of propaganda, if you want to put it in those terms. But media primer, so that's just one form of work. And I think the question of politics versus art, or politics and art, is a bit of a red herring. I mean, we could actually have experienced this directly in Holland, because there's very little coverage of the demonstrations in New York against the war on American television. Somewhat more in Holland. And who showed up on Dutch television? I don't think anybody was aware of that, but Martha Rosler was interviewed during the Dutch news while she was videotaping the demonstrations going on. So you talk about effects and efficacy of what you're doing. You can't control that. But more likely it would be a question of context and audiences. And therefore I'm bringing up this notion of the primer, because you also start talking about a question of education, pedagogy. What is your relationship to that? Because I presume also you do this in this context, but you would want to present this material in a different way in other contexts, being it in a gallery or...
I think I agree with a lot of what you said, and in terms of a primer, that's one way of sort of seeing it, and it's very close to how I presented the material today. It's not, I just think the media is changing very rapidly. The reason I the kind of techniques and approaches they use change, and some things remain the same. But for me, it was just it's like an exercise, that's all. It was just to take this period where it seems that a lot of the new bells and whistles are going to be uploaded onto this sort of software of television, and capture it and then look at it and see what's going on with television. So it was for me like an educational process. And so in terms of even effectivity on a very local way, I'm thinking about how it will inform my future work with video. Like an intro or something?
Yeah, but
Is
I
that
don't
right?
know. I would like to
Well,
answer.
a primer is, I thought you'd actually latch onto that term because
That's so playful.
we had a prior discussion about Paul Ryan, and one of the things he was
Yeah.
doing, of course, in the early 70s was making media primers.
Yeah.
It's slightly provocative that I bring that up because it's pedagogical, but it's also the idea of unlocking a field of knowledge.
I
And
see.
writing the primer as in writing a lexicon, but more than that, is actually teaching you how to deal with that field of experience. So
Yeah.
it's, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because you asked about the tools and what you care about. For me, I mean, it depends on the context. I mentioned already, well, whatever, it doesn't matter if I don't feel like there's the separation artist, non-artist. But if I'm taking something to task, I think there's a site where it is, whether it's a building I'm interested in analyzing, or a book, or a film. I think that's a common ground. So I could imagine also the footage of Renee also as a kind of a site where I take it to task, and then each of these sites has a different kind of language that you need to speak. Then I would like to be working like a surgeon, like a doctor, putting up things and taking things apart and hopefully putting something together that is different. So it depends. I have different experiences with different media, and I think this is the method in general that I would be thinking. And the tools of these, like whether it's the knife of the surgeon or an X-Acto knife, in literal sense where you saw it in the first dictionary, for example, or metaphorical, but the tools need to be adapted to the site or the context that you have. If it's a film, it's a different one, and if it's a dictionary, it's a different one. So I think.
Yeah, and also, I mean, just to connect back to the primer thing, I think it's really interesting because Paul Ryan is early video kind of proponent and somebody who really believed in video.
Maybe you say what he did, what is about, because maybe people don't know Paul Ryan, and then.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like maybe you can do it because I talk too much already.
Never brought him up.
But the point I would make to what you were saying is, I was thinking initially of using all of this to make a video, which might still happen. I'm not sure. The point being, though, I thought it's way more interesting to present the process of looking through the footage and thinking about it. That was just a kind of decision I arrived to in looking at the material. So for sure, there's a kind of, that's a decision that was made, that has, I don't know, so, thinking about the site, thinking about how I'm working with this material, and I'm thinking, well, to make a video, how effective is it, and really what I want to say, maybe it's nicer to show the footage and talk about it somehow.
I have to say one thing, because Renee was here, not you, Renee. She's in Amsterdam, and she said that I forgot to mention that the dictionary was published in Looking, Encountering, Staging, which is a Pietzwart publication. Just
Paul Ryan.
Any more questions, comments?
I have. I don't know how to formulate. Maybe my question simply it's about what do you think of the notion of non-language or pure image? And I can offer maybe 3 grounds for this. I don't need to ground or like pretext. And one is under confounding word, we have 2 programs. One is this lecture programs, and the other is exhibition. And like obviously we have more visitors for this lecture program. So some people say nowadays theory is one. I mean, zero is over the image. And actually, that theory is about the image or about the artistic practice. And but I don't agree with that. I think there is another aspect where why people gather for this kind of program. And one reason for that, I think, is that immediacy and this kind of experience or sharing ideas next to each other's body, each other's voice. Relation to that, what I can say as a second ground is the, well, I don't know deeply about Benjamin's language theory, but what I found interesting in his essay about philosophy of language, I think it was like that, and he posed question actually that this language we use, it's coming really after and after. There's another way of communication. So, like our gesture and this voice or move of your hair even. Yeah, that was it. And then third one is, well, there's one film downstairs by Jean-Michel Godard, the Rhetoric music, and he say maybe it's just so well known that he always saying about this, that vision of text now cover vision of images. So these are three grounds about my question, and I wonder especially because 16 Beavers grew and what you are doing is much more centered the discursive activities rather than producing the images. And I believe the power of the images, which never can be separate from text, but still which is quite stronger than text.
Just addressed by this comment, or
No, it's a very kind of rich question. I just don't know if I want to be the first to take a stab at it.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting. I'm really interested. I haven't seen the other question or the other meetings, but the
you can
question.
see them streamlined.
The question, what is to be done sounds also a little bit lethargic. Like we don't know exactly how to engage the word, etc. And whereas at the same time we're saying, there are so many more people coming here, and this is actually a successful series. And so I'm confused about. On the one hand, there seems to be a lot of energy, and at the same time, there's sort of worry that I don't know exactly where it's coming from, except that it may have something to do with the topic, global war. But that's just a side comment.
The question is again: is it like you're critical of this, that the primacy of language and text on the image, or
Yeah.
you are
Because
worried?
like basically language is about order, and language also in in language the limit of yourself, limit of forming yourself is inherent in language. Yeah. So like this, actually though. You said those news clip. It's very complex in the way of using not only text but also image and sound. But image and sound we see and we watch actually all controlled by the text and program. So it's a text actually.
Yeah, there's no escape of language. I know, I think, I really don't know, probably there will be more things that will come to mind a little bit later. There are other ways of communicating. I think our being together in a room, having a coffee together is also a means of communication. I think at 16 Beaver it is discursive, our being together, but it's also social and primary based on a kind of friendship to each other, and maybe we cook together something, but it's not to call it, well, we cook together because it's art now. No, and I agree, it doesn't always have to be that, but I think it is important to address things so that it's not all taken by TV or by... So it depends how you use language. I mean, I don't know if that's the question. I think the question is troubling in a way, because I understand it, and I still want to ask it again. What is it actually, the question? You know, because it has a lot of elements in it. So, I mean, language speaks, as Heidegger says, so I don't know. It's sometimes that's also part of it, to understand what we're talking about in a way, because it jumps ahead.
Maybe then, can I specify a little bit? Okay, because we don't have a lot of direction.
It's okay, actually.
People seem to be interested.
You, about, your presentation. You say, like, you did before, like, short presentation, but you said this time you want to extend. So you want to try a little bit beyond what you have
Yeah, I
done.
usually have done, for various reasons, it's only been about 25 minutes. This was almost an hour. But yes, but
Why you, there is a reason behind the certain time you took for this?
yeah, I wanted to present more of the material because I felt that it would give it, present it all the more of the complexity that I see there. I think the question of also the media primer, just coming back to that, thinking about it even more. It's more like I don't see myself as an expert in this case. I think there are people who are reading and writing about television their whole life. For me, I'm interested. It's probably a big facet of my interest as an artist, but I feel more like an amateur entering something and trying to struggle, read the material, and work through it in a very sort of specific way, And to address your question about the primacy of, language or image, or I think it's I agree with Irene. It's just a very, there are people like that. If you say like cinema has a language or television has a grammar, people get very upset. Some people. It's a very kind of foundational question, what you consider to be a text, for example. I just don't know if it's fair to have a short response, to that. It's more like a philosophical question about how we relate to things. But the question of expressivity, I like bodies and language that is not outside of verbal, I think that's really an important aspect of, everybody knows in political organizing, talk is cheap, You gotta kind of act and move your body, and that has also consequences. So I like that little footnote of what you said. I just don't know about the entirety of it. It's not an either-or proposition. That's the only thing I can really say.
There's not only one language. I mean, how you work with language is very important.
Can I add something? Because we are three presenters all talking more or less about the United States, and I raised in the beginning that I was very interested in how language is used in Europe. I have the impression that it's used in a way where it's much harder sometimes to see that you're dealing with politics. I mean, the sort of footage that you've shown is so preposterous that your eyes are rolling out. But that is the problem in the Netherlands. I think that a lot of the stuff that you're looking at TV, that you're actually not as mind-boggled, or flabbergasted. But I would love to hear your comments, because we've now talked about the US, and how do you engage European?
If you recognize power structures, as we were talking about earlier with the United and how the media in the United States works, and you also would recognize the structures that are used in Holland. I mean, I don't see that there's a difference between. Can be more subtle, maybe, but so
But do you think that there is a sense, for example, that the word terror is as much in the Netherlands about language as it is in the United States?
It's all language, so maybe.
I mean, today they released that. Today's news was basically that Mohammed Bey from jail has released a booklet, and
I read this article in the NRC, which generally speaking I consider as one of the better sources of information, of news in Holland. But to my surprise, I found that the article was actually only referring to the fact that this information had been released. And it started on the front page, the prime spot. I believe on page 3 they continued, and even in another part, in the bijlage, the supplement, they went on more about it. But in the end, they said nothing else than that he had actually written something, nobody knew exactly what, and that it had been released. And they took it from every angle possible, but in the end they said nothing. They just said the fact that it had actually been released. And in that, I feel they imply a certain threat. They imply a certain lack of security. They imply a certain sense of fear. And I agree with Renske that it is less sensational, to a certain extent even, considering that it was front page news, but it's very evident. And I think it's only getting worse. I moved here 10 years ago from the United States, and the difference when I moved here and now is enormous. And I have to say it's quite disappointing, thoroughly disappointing even.
Anyone else wants to react to the question of
A comment, what should artists do? Look for the truth. I mean, it's pretty obvious how media is pro-war, and the Iraq war, what was unique with this war was the kind of build-up in the media before it actually happened. It was months and months of saying that we have to go after Saddam. There's always a kind of first name basis and all these different characters. It really becomes like a game. And the truth is so much more complex, and the background, and also come to some kind of discourse where what you're saying is both truths and false at the same time, the kind of ambiguity of art and of reality. I mean, there's other ways of seeing things always, and both as artists and as people, as humans, we need to look for the complexity of things.
Yeah, I agree. One needs to look for the truth, but the question is, what do we mean by the word truth? Because for Alain Badiou, for example, that small text I had was saying, yeah, I am looking for truth also, and that's the good, and that's against the evil. But it's more about an event that happens, an outbreak, something new that happens. So it's really, the question is, what is this truth that we're talking about? Because it can be this, it's like precisely this, that we can use a word and you say something, you mean something by it because of, the context that you surround it, whether, it really depends where, because probably René would say something else about the truth in relation to media.
Well, I think one like little step I'm taking and saying, hey, this is what I think, not in terms of the truth, big capital T, but one way of reading it is that it's not behind, it's there, It's sort of taking Rouge to task further, and it's there in the way people relate to TV when they're being filmed and shot, and how their gestures and their body and their movement and the things that are said. On the spot when he says propaganda is an amazing thing to watch unfold, or something that are beyond their own awareness. And then for me it's maybe like a Spinozist or Deleuzian sort of, it's on the surface also. You don't have to look too far to find the truth. It's maybe in this, that's one argument I'm making. It's not the only thing. I also read a lot. I think I know other things that are not just presented on the media, but I think there's also one of the points I'm trying to make in this presentation is that, there's a lot already there in whatever we watch, that's saying a lot about the society we're living in, right down to what advertisement is in the middle of the segments, because somebody's had some thought about this advertisement being placed there, It's just kind of like a surface approach.
But the truth is overloaded word in philosophy, so it's good to maybe try to replace it with something else.
But I think I kind of like it. I like it because it's very like old school.
Because I think there's a text by George Orwell, and there he's like it's about precisely. Yeah, I didn't use it here, but it's saying what we mean without using the word. It's interesting because then we get more further into what we want to say, maybe. We get away from jargon, maybe, or something like that.
So yeah, maybe truth is then too complicated. What about honesty? That's somehow what's transpired with the present administration. Administration is. I mean, I'm not sure they are looking for the truth. I mean, there's a dishonesty kind of running through all of these different actions. It can just be your tone of voice or the way you kind of share your what you want to say with the other people. And also, if you have some kind of claim of absolute authority behind what you're saying or not, or if you're open for other points of view. So, yeah.
Do you have a proposition on this, or?
Well, it made me think about this story Hannah Arendt tells, where someone asks Clemenceau, what was the cause of the First World War? Or what will they say the cause of the First World War was? And he says, well, I don't know, but I don't think they will say Belgium invaded Germany. So that there at one point, maybe 80 years ago, there was a consensus around facts, and that facts could emerge, and there was a public realm in which facts could occur. And somehow I think we don't have this anymore. Because at one point we had 75% of the United States thinking Saddam Hussein was involved with September 11th, and something like half of Germany believing that George Bush was involved with September 11th. And that's at the same moment. Now, I could say which side I would fall on, but and that's maybe what I was trying to allude to, not so precisely, by saying that that I'm more interested in what you do after your presentation, in which you demonstrate so clearly how the substance of public debate has no substance and has been so sophisticatedly manipulated. And I'm not, and then your question of what is the truth becomes loaded again, because it's not just philosophical truth or truth of opinion. We also now have a diminished relationship to truth of fact. For instance, is there a secret police in Holland that is organizing terrorist organizations? This is now a contested question in truth of fact. So, and I think that being explicitly referring to these political situations we find ourselves in, which underpin state funding for cultural organizations, which then propose programming to reflect upon war, is a good start. But I myself don't have any answers for what to do with it. That was why I was throwing it back to you with, okay, so if this stuff is propaganda, I mean, how do you continue to watch it besides out of some perverse fascination in the machine?
I have to say, after watching a lot of this footage, I mean, I really have taken a long hiatus from mainstream television. So, I mean, I felt like I did my tour of duty. Every once in a while I do watch and sort of track words and how things are being used, but that's just a very kind of personal response. It's not really answering your question. I think it's more a provocation, your question.
Shall we perhaps relocate any other urgent questions upstairs, maybe, in a more informal setting, and maybe some drinks?
There seems to be room in the audience.
Thank you very much.